I've been thinking a lot about my Screams in Silence review lately, and that's not only because one of my upcoming reviews is going to be Peter Asment. You see, I've written a script for that review long before the Drawn Together movie review, and I'm sitting on it because I know that it's going to open a can of worms. I mean, it's an episode that basically asks the audience to sympathize with the rapist. The thing is, that rapist in the episode is female. Family Guy has a lot of episodes like this where they try to tackle a tough subject matter, and they botch it completely. Most of my Family Guy reviews are going to be on subjects like this, with things like Quagmire's Dad, Brian's a Bad Father, Family Gay, and as you already know, Seahorse Seashell Party, and Screams in Silence. This particular episode, though, is kind of a different story. While I genuinely like this review, I don't think I went into the episode enough. If I covered all angles, that review would be about 30 minutes long, though. So here are the other 15 minutes, I guess, of things that I didn't get to in the actual review. Screams in Silence is different because even if all of the problems that I pointed out in my review were not there, the episode would still be an atrocity. I mean, one of the bigger problems is that Screams in Silence is horribly cliched. Every single Lifetime movie of the week has this plot, and that's a problem. Not the fact that they're cliched, but because of what the cliches are. Domestic abuse, as portrayed in the media, is not well done. I don't think that really covers it. The only thing portrayed worse in our media is postpartum depression. Here's a general television rule. If a woman in any television show, movie, or whatever comes down with postpartum depression, she will inevitably try to kill the infant. Considering that each year almost 1 million women get postpartum depression, and we don't have an infanticide epidemic, it's safe to say that these stereotypes are greatly exaggerated. This is bad because it breeds mistrust. If your only exposure to knowledge of PPD were these media stories, and your wife was showing signs of depression after giving birth, how would you react? The answer is, in a way that makes the problem a lot worse. If we treated women with postpartum depression like they'd follow the logical progression in a dramatic story, we'd put them in situations that would make the postpartum depression worse. But that's postpartum depression. Let's go back to domestic abuse. Combined with media portrayals, our knowledge of domestic abuse, even from things like charities, have the Autism Speaks effect. The most extreme, severe cases are the cases that are broadcast the most far and wide. Unless you personally experience something otherwise, your idea of domestic abuse is a strong man beating down on a helpless woman who can't get help no matter how hard she tries. And she only got into the situation because he seemed so sweet and lovable before they were married, or they had children, or whatever. I mean, you should give us all your money because one day it could be you in this situation. This kind of portrayal is bad for everyone involved. Men and women. And much of this video will be going into the reasons why. I understand that it's not a popular move to go after charities, barring certain infamous ones, but many are prone to corruption. Even more are prone to misinterpreting the data using buzzwords or glittering generalities. You need to provide very strict scrutiny to the charities that you support. But even if charities do this, isn't it good that they're spreading awareness though? Well, let's think about it this way. When PETA compares chicken farming to the Holocaust, it makes people take PETA far less seriously, and by extension, the horrors of chicken farming. When Autism Speaks makes a terrible PSA like this one, it ends up dehumanizing the people who actually have autism. When a charity shows the situation displayed in Screams in Silence as the only form of domestic abuse, what does it do to those experiencing domestic abuse? First of all, let's get some statistics. Actually, let's not get some statistics. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, many charities are using statistics any way that they want and are guilty of using highly selective data. Number two, let me show you how statistics work. You are 30 times more likely to be killed by a dog than a shark, statistically. Statistically, a dog is more likely to kill you than a shark. Is a dog more dangerous than a shark? The answer is no. This is because people spend more time with their dogs than they do in shark-infested water. This is the same reason more people die in car crashes than in plane crashes. We can make statistics say whatever we want, and when it comes to topics like this, we often do. You should not base your life or your actions on statistics like this. If I based my life on statistics, I'd be agoraphobic. One of the persons most likely to be the victim of a violent crime? A young male adult between the ages of 12 and 24. Let me put it this way. A woman is less likely to be the victim of a violent crime if she is pregnant. The logic that many charities operate on is, to reduce violent crime against women, we must encourage them to be as pregnant as much as possible. Statistically, getting pregnant would reduce your chances of being a victim of a violent crime. Realistically, you're insane if you believe this. Believing that our personal lives fall into the realm of a statistical average is a fallacy. So what though? Even if these charities charities are misinterpreting data, they're at least helping the cause, right? Okay, let's try this thought experiment. This charity has been collecting billions of dollars to help grant women scholarships. Because they make more money, they're able to broadcast everywhere. Of course, they're pushing smaller charities out of business. And even more dishonorably, this charity is doing it by skewing the truth. They claim that women turn into monsters for about 5 days once every lunar cycle. They grossly misinterpreted what a period is. Would it matter how much money that this charity made? Especially because it broadcasts so much, the stereotypes become associated with the concept. So, let's talk about a realistic situation of domestic abuse. The first misconception is that all or most domestic abuse is one way, man on woman. Half of all domestic abuse is reciprocal. This means that both the man and the woman don't quite get along on a heavily consistent basis. If any charity website obscures this information, it is highly likely that they have biased other facts. I'm not going to tell you how much the rest of it is man on woman or woman on man. The answers probably go against your common assumptions though, because your average man and your average woman do have a similar capacity for abuse. And like I said, we should not focus our reality on the statistics. The most common defense to the accusation that women can be as violent as men is that a man is much stronger and larger than a woman, and thus his abuse is much worse than hers. Let's see what the facts say, because facts are facts, they can't be misinterpreted. An average man weighs, or is supposed to weigh, about 180 pounds. An average woman is supposed to weigh 156 pounds. That is a difference of over 20 pounds, and that can do a lot with muscle mass. On the other hand, this is a Canadian grizzly bear. It weighs at least 290 pounds, but can go up to 400. It also has very sharp claws, of which to use to rip your face off. All throughout history, this has hunted this, using things like this. And it turns out, if a woman wanted to do harm to something stronger than her, she'd use fairly similar methods. I don't know if this is encouraging or not, but if someone in your life really wanted to kill you, you would be dead right now. Think of the average home. Even if you don't own a gun, which many people still do, your house contains a butcher's block of knives, lethal doses of medication, poisonous bleach, dangerous electrical wiring, possibly a swimming pool, the car, a hammer, and a drop from the roof to concrete. I mean, statistically, most people die in the home. In 2006, an Australian woman stabbed her husband 37 times with a butcher's knife and then fed his pieces to her children. That was not a typical case of domestic abuse, and neither is Screams in Silence, because most domestic abuse is not physical. Real life, for better or worse, is not as dramatic as we sometimes believe it is, and we tend to forget that when we deal with situations like domestic abuse, mental illness, or terrorist attacks. One parent telling their child lies about how the other parent is evil is not as dramatic as a punch to the face, but it's a much more common form of domestic abuse. That's because we tend to forget what domestic abuse is really about. You may have heard this one before. Domestic violence is not about violence. It's about control. In fact, it should be called domestic abuse, not domestic violence. Domestic violence has a very bad misconception that it's all physical. Every type of domestic abuse is an attempt to coerce and control the person experiencing the domestic abuse. Which method is a man more likely to use? Which method is a woman more likely to use? Here's the answer. I can tell you statistically, but realistically, whatever they're best at. That could be constantly verbally berating the other person, preventing the other person from getting a job and financial independence, preventing a person from seeing their friends or family, gaslighting and making the other person thinking that they're losing their mind. Now let's talk about how stories like Screams in Silence and propaganda similar to it, misinterpreting the facts for dramatic effect, hurts everyone that it's trying to save. Let's start with the group that you're going to have the hardest time believing me about. Screams in Silence type stories hurt females experiencing domestic abuse. Remember in the episode that Brenda kept making excuses for Jeff about how he's really not that bad? There's a name for this. It's called battered person syndrome. As you might have guessed, it used to be called battered woman syndrome before people got the idea in their head that men could also experience domestic abuse. Now, what is someone with battered person syndrome to do when their spouse isn't as physical as Jeff, but is just gaslighting them or just actively preventing them from getting a job? Because that's not their idea of what domestic abuse is. They do not see it as domestic abuse. They stay in the abusive situation, and because it's not as dramatic as a black eye and bloody nose, this person's friends, if they're allowed to have them, are none the wiser. Somewhere out there are many men, women, and children thinking that they are in a healthy relationship while they are being abused because their perspective on abuse has been skewed by this propaganda and the media. Does that sound like a pleasant solution to domestic abuse to you? We shouldn't use this kind of method for the same reason we shouldn't use nuclear weapons to win every single war. You're going to succeed on one level, but you're going to fail on every other. When an abusive situation is your reality, you're not likely going to see it as abusive, and you're not going to get help. All of the charity money in the world is not going to help someone experiencing domestic abuse who does not think they are in an abusive situation. One of my most common criticisms that I get on my Screams in Silence video is that I didn't talk about female on male domestic abuse. It might not be the best excuse in the world, but I just didn't have time, and I wanted to keep focus. However, I am very glad that I am getting this criticism, because it means that people are becoming more and more aware that abuse is wrong no matter who is doing it. This relieves me because in the past, the law was highly biased against men. Many states have or have had primary aggressor laws. What would happen is that almost unilaterally, no matter the situation, men will be the ones arrested in a domestic dispute simply because he was larger. Wait, wasn't domestic abuse about control? What could one person do if they could just make a phone call and get another person arrested sight unseen? I want to show you some specific pieces of domestic violence propaganda. These two, you may have seen them. They were infamously criticized for their gender bias. Let's ignore that for now, and I'll translate what these campaigns are saying to those they claim are trying to help. One day my husband will kill me. The story of this piece is that she grew up in an abusive family. Okay, you've just gotten a little girl out of an abusive home, and you are telling her that she needs to be paranoid about every single relationship she will ever have, and that she should have a very unhealthy level of distrust that will lead to a very unhappy and unhealthy life. One of the most important things to teach people who have experienced domestic abuse is to trust again, believe it or not. Let's look at the boys. When I grow up, I will beat my wife. Let's assume this boy you've rescued from an abusive home is not a psycho. He begins to loathe himself and fears that he's going to do something horrible someday. He becomes afraid to seek help, thinking he doesn't deserve it. And if you want to prevent the quote-unquote cycle of abuse from repeating, you need to teach them what they've experienced wasn't normal and see the situation rationally and objectively. I hate stories like this that hint that the cycle of abuse is repeating. It says absolutely horrible things to those who are most innocent. Does this happen? Sure, but should we assume that it's going to? It's not just the general public who sees this kind of stuff and reacts to it with their own stereotypes and ideas. It is the very people experiencing the domestic abuse themselves, and that paints a perspective of who they are. I understand the logic and the fear behind these situations. No one wants the scenario of the courts don't believe her, she gets sent home and is beaten to death. We've attempted and failed to make this impossible through sidewinding the law every way possible, and we've ended up with a situation that says the courts must believe her no matter what she says, and he goes to jail with all the fun stuff that comes with that. To some people, that's a perfectly fair trade-off, and I choose not to associate with them because they tend to have a screw loose or two. The sad part is that either of those definitely hurts men, but either of them also hurts women, because you cannot discriminate against one gender without boomeranging back and hurting your own. If the former situation managed to foster an unhealthy level of distrust against men, then the latter situation would definitely foster an unhealthy level of distrust against women. And wasn't the definition of misogyny the hatred, mistrust, and fear of women? Most people, men and women, are not evil, abusive, crazy, or sociopathic. And that's a moral you're not going to see very often on your Lifetime Movie of the Week. We're not done yet. There's one segment of domestic abuse that I have not talked about yet, and that's domestic abuse against the LGBT community. With the recent passing of gay marriage in the United States, and all the reasons I mentioned before, it is very politically unpopular to talk about domestic abuse in LGBT couples. In the media, and with this propaganda, it's entirely invisible, which is sometimes worse than the truth being skewed. People tend not to think it exists because we still have this stupid thought that without one man punching a woman, abuse hasn't happened. I think as adults, we can realize that men can punch men and women can punch women. I mean, some people stereotype gay and lesbian couples as horrifying, and those people are morons. Other people stereotype gay and lesbian couples as eternally in each other's bliss, and with them being in passionate love for every single second. Gay and lesbian couples are a lot more like regular couples than the other side seems to realize, and that does include the bad parts as well. They experience similar rates of domestic abuse that heterosexual people do, and this comes with all manner of problems, and some of them are extremely discouraging. First of all, many sources of domestic violence aid are still highly based on gender dynamics, and it's hard to aid people in that situation when the dispute is between two people of the same gender. This leads to very little outreach. Not to mention that homophobia is still, unfortunately, a problem. To admit that you are being abused by your partner in that scenario, you do have to out yourself in most scenarios, and the person experiencing the abuse may not be ready, because it could legitimately lead to hate crimes, family rejection, and bullying. A whole host of stereotypes still exist, and some people would be so stupid and cruel as to think that they deserve this abuse just for being gay. Trans people may be barred from places like women's shelters because of their gender history, and some people believe that rape would not be traumatic for a gay man. If I sound bleak, it's because this entire situation is bleak. The entire way we treat domestic violence and domestic abuse in the media is horrible, and I'm not even finished yet. First of all, you may have noticed that I've been referring to people experiencing domestic violence, not victims or survivors. Both of them predispose stereotypes that the person experiencing domestic violence may abhor or not be a part of. You've heard of the term objectification, I'm sure. Yeah, you know, all the above. That is a perfect example of objectification. Objectification is not treating the person like a person, but an object or a thing. You know, like they're nothing more than a punching bag. They may be treated as a tool for the objectifier's own purposes, like stealing sympathy. It denies them any sense of autonomy, saying that they can't help themselves, which makes a person experiencing domestic abuse, you guessed it, not seek out help. Types of objectification are reduction to body, reduction to appearance, and speaking for them. By traditional definitions, a victim cannot help themselves. If they do, they become something called a survivor. Both survivors and victims have many stereotypes surrounding them, and once again, stereotypes do not help anyone. A survivor may be deeply affected by their situation and still might need therapy. They still might need much sympathy. A victim may literally not be able to physically escape their situation, even though they fight tooth and nail every single day. If that's not surviving, I don't know what is. A victim is stereotyped as weak, and a survivor is stereotyped as strong. It may sound weird, but neither are good stereotypes to hold, and they hurt people in various ways. It all comes down to this. When we make up people for charity, those people that we make up are the ones who end up getting the charity. The real people end up getting none. Stories like this hurt all people experiencing domestic violence. Men, women, children, homosexual or heterosexual. They create pervasive stereotypes that create obstacles to prevent people from getting the help that they might need. They downplay the less dramatic but more realistic displays of domestic abuse, and they ignore everything that doesn't fit this specific story. If a man ran up to you, clearly having been in a scuffle, and says that his wife had just gone nuts, your first reaction should not be to consult the statistics. If it was a woman, the same exact thing. No matter what the numbers say, reality is different. Next time, oh boy, I get to talk about sexual harassment. This should be fun.